Good evening, Amanda. Or actually, in your case, it's good morning, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It's 6 in the morning.
Oh dear, I'm so sorry. I know.
Oh no, this is not bad at all.
Well, I mean, we did a double Australian gig the other day, but it's so hard to figure out time zones. But isn't it wonderful that we can actually do this? We can
Oh,
Zoom.
oh, of course. Yes, definitely. It's really awesome for me being in Sri Lanka that I'm going to be able to connect with you, of course, and then with readers all around the world. So it's been
Well,
an
this
awesome
is
experience.
Amanda Jayatissa's second book. You're invited, and you can tell by the cover design, which is an invitation, that there's something afoot, which we will get to. But we had the pleasure of talking to Amanda last year with her debut, My Sweet Girl. And that one, it involved Sri Lanka, but much of the action took place in the United States, with
Hmm.
many scenes flashing back to earlier life in Sri Lanka. This one, while a character lives in Los Angeles, she is invited, or she gets an invitation to a crazy rich Asians wedding style in Sri Lanka. So in fact, we're kind of going the other direction. Why is it that you like that link between LA and Sri Lanka? Is it something that means anything personal to you, or do they just seem similar, or what intrigues you about it?
Oh, between LA and Sri Lanka?
Yeah.
Well, I felt LA was an interesting place for my character because I think I set it up so that she and her best friend went to university in Northern California. And as you know, if when you go through the book, some very traumatic and eventful things happened 5 years before the story takes place, which really made Amaya, that's our main character, crave a fresh start. So she comes back to Sri Lanka, a lot of things happen. And then when she goes back to the States, of course, she doesn't want to go back to San Francisco, which has a lot of memories and things like that for her that created all this heartbreak. And LA just seems like a place to go. It's in California. It's still close by to what she knows. There's actually, interestingly enough, a very large Sri Lankan community in LA. So it just seemed like a good choice for her to make a fresh start, I think.
I wasn't aware. I mean, I knew about Koreatown and other things. I wasn't aware there was a significant Sri Lankan community in
Mhm.
Los Angeles. Is it a very old one, or is it more recent?
I think it's been around for quite a while, probably about 2 or 3 generations now, I would think.
Aha. Okay. Well, that makes a more natural tie. It's always
Mhm.
good if you go somewhere. It's still nice to take some of your past and some of your country people with you, so you don't feel completely alone.
Mhm.
I mean, the world is increasingly a place of immigration or migration,
Mhm.
whatever you want to call it. Although, if we really look back at prehistoric records, apparently that was always true. People wandered all over, and here we are doing it again, especially
Mhm.
with climate change. I don't know how it is for you there, but in the last, let's see, yesterday, was it yesterday? Yeah, yesterday I talked to an author living in France where it was 10
Mhm.
degrees hotter than it is here in Phoenix, which is really hard to believe, Arizona in August. And then
Right.
a couple of weeks before that, I talked to two British authors, one in London and one in Oxford and down on the coast. And it was again several degrees hotter in England than it
Mhm.
is here. So I'm trying to remember which side of the equator are you in our top of the equator, or are you slightly underneath it
We're about at the equator.
at the equator?
Yeah, so it's
Okay.
very, very warm here, probably right throughout the year. We don't really have seasons. We have sort of the wet season and the dry
Right.
season with like the monsoons and things like that. But we don't have significant winters in Sri Lanka at all. It's usually pretty hot and humid here, very tropical weather.
Well, we do have seasons, but
Hmm.
interestingly enough, it's been under 100 degrees all week. It's raining, so climate change is really doing weird things
Oh,
here, but apparently it's staying fairly consistent in Sri Lanka, which I have not visited, but I am told by friends who have. It's a truly beautiful country. What I
it is
know of
lovely.
it, what I know of it is watching Good Karma Hospital, which is this wonderful.
Right.
In theory, it takes place in India, but in fact, it's
Hmm.
all been
It's
shot.
recorded here. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's just gorgeous. I mean, the scenes on the beach and the festivals and all the rest of it. We're hoping that they will do yet another season. But has that been fun for Sri Lanka? They have, because it's a fairly popular series that has, many countries watching it.
Yep, that's right. I think it's very popular in sort of the UK, and I know a lot of Sri Lankans sort of in that region that watch it. It's not televised on local TV here, so you have to do the shady streaming methods to try and watch it. But it's a great show, and one of the main actresses on the show is Sri Lankan, and she's absolutely fantastic. So Nimi Haraskama is her name. She plays the nurse.
The nurse, yeah,
Mhm.
gorgeous.
So
Oh, Lord,
yeah,
she is so beautiful. Her
so
eyes
beautiful.
are amazing.
Right. She's lovely, and she's such a lovely person too. I've had the pleasure of meeting her a few times, and she's
Oh,
absolutely wonderful. So yeah, it's really cool. It's very nice to see Sri Lankans making waves, internationally. It's always very cool because we're such a small country, so it's really nice when it's highlighted sort of in TV shows and things like that.
there are a couple of historical mysteries set in Sri Lanka that have come out from your very publisher, if I remember it correctly, over the last year or two, and I'm drawing a total blank. As I often do, it's just a function of old age here because titles and stuff go right out of my head. But they are indeed set in Sri Lanka, and not in Colombo, but and involve, pretty sure that they are probably British colonials living in Sri Lanka.
Mm.
I think one of them is the widow of somebody from the Indian Army who arrives in Sri Lanka and so forth. But anyway, yeah, it's wonderful that there are characters being portrayed not only in the present, like in your book, but also in the past. So I am fascinated with the way that you portray relationships among women. I mean, in My Sweet Girl, you had one complicated female relationship, and now here again in this one. And you love misdirection. So, are you a person who's actually experienced any sort of complicated relationships with friends like this, or is this all your imagination?
Well, none of it involves murder, thank goodness.
Okay.
So I can, clear the air with that. No, but the idea of friendships, like female friendships, and also friendship breakups, has been something that I have thought about. It's been one of those ideas that had been percolating in my mind, I think, for quite a while before I started writing the book, because I think when it comes to romantic breakups, as a society, we give it its due space, right? There's this period of mourning where you're almost expected to sit on your couch and watch romantic movies and eat a pint of ice cream, and your girlfriends will all rally around you and tell you that you deserve so much better than that loser. So we have this grieving process that is widely acceptable for romantic breakups. But when it comes to friendship breakups, which are just as, and sometimes even more painful, we really don't have a way of processing that. We're just kind of expected to get on with our lives. And in the case of, say, Amaya and Kavi, they've had this very strong bond. They grew up together, they went to the same university together, Kavi's family was pretty much Amaya's family. And then suddenly this horrible thing happens, and they're not speaking to each other anymore, and they're both grieving, except they're not really expected to grieve. They're expected to get on with their lives, and both of them, of course, go about coping with this in very, very different ways, as we see in the story.
Do you think these friendships are more, do they almost have to be formed when one is young? I mean, I'm trying to work out whether middle-aged women would bond and have this same sort of twisty thing, or whether it's really, or whether it's really more part of, of a coming of age kind of a thing, because having a friend is part of that process.
It is definitely something to think about. I think the closeness you form, especially during your formative years, when you're a teenager, when you're through university, sometimes it feels like those friendships are forged in so much. I don't know, the feelings are so intense, right? When you're younger, you're going through so much, you're sharing these situations with your your friends, and it does lend itself, of course, to creating these lifelong bonds that sometimes don't go away. But at the same time, those friendships do end, like they've ended for me in some instances, and I can say that they are very painful. Especially when you lose touch with someone that once knew all your secrets, and you'd stay up till 3 or 4 in the morning talking and bearing your soul, and now suddenly a few years have gone by and you don't know anything about them. I mean, you might follow them on social media and know a little bit about what's going on in their life, but that's about it. And I mean, it's happened. I think it's a pretty common thing that's happened. It's definitely happened to me. And you don't really hold that space to miss those people. You just sort of get on with your life, and it can be kind of sad.
Well, I think, there are markers as we grow up that we use to work out who we are and our place in the world and how we
Hmm.
relate to people and so forth. And I think it's inevitable that some of those are going to fall away because as we evolve, we're not the person at 12 that we
No.
maybe are at 19. But what I also think, in both books, one of the women lacks the family or lacks a really strong family. And
Hmm.
so she bonds, certainly was true in My Sweet Girl.
Hmm.
I mean, the orphanage, the whole bit. And
Hmm.
so the friendship can, in some respects, replace siblings or even parents as,
Hmm.
the one person that you feel like has your back and that you can share
Yeah.
who you are with and so forth. So, I find that a powerful element in My Sweet Girl, but it's also true when here for Amaya as well. If
Hmm.
Kavi's family has been kind of her family, does
Yeah.
that make that sense of betrayal when things go wrong even stronger?
Oh, certainly. I mean, the Fonsecas, who are Kavi's family, certainly had a pretty large role to play, as we find out in all the events that happened, without going into any spoilers, which I'm very conscious about because I sometimes tend to, it's a slippery slope for me. Um, but yeah, the family definitely plays a large role in the story. So the sense of betrayal or the sense of loss and longing is probably heightened for someone like Amaya that depended so much on her friend, not just for her friendship, but for her that sense of community, and that sense of protection and that sense of family as well.
Yeah, no, I think there's definitely the idea that you were thrown out of your family, which is a painful thing for anybody,
Of course.
to have to endure. So, but there's another complicating factor in this story, which is Kavi is the bride, but she's
Hmm.
getting married to
Uh-huh.
Maya's former boyfriend.
Hmm.
Ooh. So Maya, is she actually invited to the wedding or is she determined to go to the wedding?
Well, she makes it there, let's say that. And, she definitely gets there. There is, again, she gets this invitation
Right.
from Kavi out of the blue. She hasn't spoken to her in 5 years. So there's a lot of mixed emotions, right? Because, I mean, imagine that you haven't spoken to your best friend for 5 years. You've created a ton of fake Instagram profiles just so that you can stalk her and interact with her online. You're looking at all her photos, you're commenting on all her photos and her videos. Um, it's almost this creepy like watching through windows thing of the new age, right? You can't stand out and peer in through someone's window, but what you can do is get obsessive with their social media. And then suddenly, out of the blue, she gets this email. Hey, you know I know we haven't spoken in a while, but I'm getting married and I'd love for you to be there. Oh, by the way, it's your ex-boyfriend. I hope that's all right, but I'd love to see you. So of course you're going to feel all the feelings, right? Of course you're going to feel some sense of rage, some sense of betrayal, some sense of hurt and pain and emptiness. And I don't know, there'll be a large spectrum of things. And of course, as you learn more about why their friendship did fall apart, and the strong feelings that Amaya has towards, many characters, you really understand why she's feeling everything she's feeling.
So would this novel, would it even be possible, the story that you're telling, or at least the structure that you're using, even be possible before social media? Because you're right. I mean, basically what she is, you've created a peeping Tom, except that she does it by creating different names on social media. But part of that is Kavi, she didn't post so much on social media, then her life would not be nearly so visible. So she's inviting, in a way, she's inviting people into her life by doing that.
Yeah, but it's also not her life, essentially, right? It's a small part of her life that she's curating and choosing to show. And how honest is that life? The idea for this essentially came from this time. It was a few years ago, I remember, and my husband and we had gone out for dinner to a pretty nice restaurant in Colombo. And at the table next to us, there was a couple who had also come out for dinner. And it was very interesting. I sort of knew her. She was, I think, sort of like a model / Instagram influencer. And she had come out for dinner with her boyfriend. And they did not, the entire meal, they did not speak more than 3 or 4 sentences to each other. They spent the entire time on their individual phones, did not look like they were having a particularly great time, just seemed distracted. I think he grunted at her once when she asked him something. And I thought, okay, fine, to each their own, that's their relationship. But then when I got back home, and I think it's because we were in the same restaurant, and sometimes they show you posts. The internet has a weird way of doing that, of showing you posts of places that you've been. And I think that was why, but one of her social media posts popped up of that evening, and it was such a completely different picture. It was a photo of them with their arms around each other. It's like, happy anniversary. It was the most romantic night that I've had. And, there are these photos of them holding hands. And it was just such a different picture to what I saw happen. And it was just something that really, really stuck with me, is how much we show of our true selves, or how much of it is just a version of ourselves, that it's this curated sort of image that's handpicked and selected. These photographs are selected to convey a certain message. And whether or not that's the truth, maybe they had those feelings towards each other, but this is, it's just sometimes so different, reality versus what you portray on social media. So I really wanted to consider that dynamic with Kavi, because she does have this very strong, very perfect persona, and that comes out very strongly on her social media. But how much of that is real? How much of what Amaya knows about Kavi is real? Is sort of the question that I had a lot of fun kind of exploring.
Indeed, you did. I mean, there's been all kinds of discussion about how, Instagram can make people depressed. It can make them feel their lives are, shabby, not particularly worth it. There are other, I mean, it's introduced what's fascinating about crime fiction, because I've been reading it for much longer than you've been alive, is that as technology and other stuff comes along, crime fiction has to adapt to it. Adapt to it. So, we've kind of gone from fingerprints and Sherlock Holmes with his tobacco and magnifying glass, into much more complicated stuff. And as cell phones have changed the way people have to work, and definition of privacy and tracking, and CCTV has changed police investigations in many ways, and DNA and all the rest of it. Clearly, social media has provided a whole new framework for particularly, I think, what we call novels of psychological suspense. Not a straightforward police investigation. The police might be involved, but generally the lead characters are not policemen, but
Mm-hmm.
or detectives, but rather just people, caught up in stuff. Often
Mm-hmm.
involves family relationships or romantic relationships. There has to be some glue, right, that holds the
Mm-hmm.
characters together. And then
Mm-hmm.
without that, there wouldn't even be a sense of betrayal, would they? I mean, if they were just total strangers, if
Sure.
I had just happened to watch Kavi every once in a while for fun, casually, then there wouldn't be any emotion generated. There wouldn't be any
Mm-hmm.
possibility of betrayal or a potential reason to want to murder somebody. So basically, what you have is Amaya, she gets this invitation, whether it really comes from Kavi or not, I won't even go into. And, what does she feel? Is she excited for Kavi or is she feeling rage?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely there's a spectrum of emotions there. We can't even get it. Like it's gonna be such a process. I mean, even for me, it was such a process to like untangle everything and then of course like retangle everything and package it up into the book, right?
Yeah.
But definitely with her emotions, there is a wide spectrum there. And hopefully it'll make sense to readers as the story goes on.
Well, I think it does. I think it's very well crafted.
Oh, thank you.
And yeah, you're welcome. And I like I like the hook, and then I like the way it all develops. But you have to have some strong emotional current to make this work. It has to be um, a very powerful one that sweeps these characters along. It makes them do what they do.
Mhm.
What about the boyfriend? I mean, is he just a sort of cipher in this whole thing, or does he play an important role? The groom.
The groom and the ex-boyfriend. No, he suddenly plays a pretty significant role. Um, the extent to it and the way he plays a significant role, I don't think I should talk about too much because I feel that the less said about his relationship with Amaya, especially, and also his relationship with Kabi, they are very different relationships.
Mhm.
And especially because we hear from the women's side of things. So definitely the relationships and the way they unfolded was different because the two women are very different and their ways of dealing with men and situations and their approach and how much they like to hold on to control versus relinquish control. Like that is something that's very different between the two women. So it is certainly something that impacts their individual relationships with the groom. And yeah, it's he does definitely play a big role. uh, and Kavi of course has again a slew of emotions when it comes to her relationship with him. Breakups are hard anyway, especially when you've been with someone for a long time, and again through your formative sort of years. She dated him throughout college, um, and this was her first time away from home and her first probably meaningful relationship outside of her friendship with Kavi and her family. So when that relationship ended, of course, there was a certain emptiness inside her that she was trying to fill. And of course, she took a while to and she's still not recovered from it when the story starts. She still has not, I think perhaps it's towards the very end of the story that you see her actively take steps in a somewhat positive direction, because for the past 5 years she's been wallowing in this sense of hurt and guilt and anger and frustration and everything she's feeling. And that has really impacted her ability to form meaningful relationships beyond that, which is anyway difficult, right? Because beyond university, I think making friends is something that is very hard. Like when you're in high school, or when you're in school in general, or when you're in college, friendships is something that are formed quite naturally, right? You're thrown into these situations where you have to make friends. But beyond that, adult friendships are so much more hard to forge, and seeking out a sense of community is so much more difficult. And when you're recovering from certain things that have happened to you, it makes it that much harder. So of course Amaya is struggling.
Well, it's certainly true that when you're in high school and college, you have a definite population that
Mm-hmm,
you are surrounded with. And when you get out into the adult world, it all fractures. And, then,
mm-hmm,
maybe it's people at the gym or people at the coffee shop or people at the office or,
mm-hmm,
whatever it might be. But it's harder to find those communities that you
mm-hmm,
can relate to. But, from a story structure standpoint, a triangle is certainly better than just two people. I mean, I think to really create the kind of story you're writing, you really do need that triangle in
mm-hmm,
order to have conflict run up and down. But let's talk about the wedding. This is a week-long wedding.
mm-hmm,
So destination weddings have become a thing and,
mm-hmm,
can be incredibly expensive. Every once in a while, I read some of the agony and advice columns in the paper just to kind of see,
mm-hmm,
what's going on in the world. And an astonishing percentage of them is about weddings.
mm-hmm,
I mean, who's invited, who's not invited, the
mm-hmm,
cost of attending, if the bride and the groom are going to get married in the Maldives or something,
mm-hmm,
then you have travel, you have all this other stuff. So here we have a very long wedding in Sri Lanka. So
mm-hmm,
it's going to be expensive if you're not there to
mm-hmm.
attend it. Um, is the bride's family, is it important that they be able to afford this? I mean, are they a wealthy family? Is that why they can do a week-long wedding?
Well, so Sri Lankan weddings are different from Indian weddings in that the ceremonial sort of events don't necessarily have to be a week-long thing. Usually for most Sri Lankan families, it would be your big wedding day, and then perhaps a week later you'd have your homecoming, which is the function that's thrown by the groom's side of the family. That's often as big as the wedding itself. So you have your two big events and usually the honeymoon in between. But what has now become more of a trend, especially amongst the wealthier families in Colombo, is that they'd have these larger celebrations. You'd have cocktail parties beforehand, you'd have of course, you'd have your bachelorette bridal shower type events, and just as many sort of fun activities, because hey, why not if you can afford it, right? This is not, of course, a destination wedding for most of the guests.
Right.
Kavi and her family are from Colombo, so for them it just makes sense for them to have it in Colombo. There are a few guests that have flown in from the US, from I think from when Kavi did an internship, and a few, I think, friends of the family who lived in the US as well. But for the better part, the guests are mostly Sri Lankan. And yeah, Sri Lankan weddings are fantastic events. They're usually quite large, regardless of whether you're from Colombo high society or not. They're usually very large events because, I think the interesting thing is in the West, weddings are more about the couple, right? It's a celebration of love between the bride and the groom. And it's very much the focus that it's the bride's day and it's what the bride wants. In Sri Lanka, it's a little bit different. I feel like weddings are more the celebration of the joining of two families. It's oftentimes the first instance where the larger or the more extended families get to meet each other. And it's really just about eating a lot of good food and having a few drinks and dancing and having a good time and getting to know each other, So the dynamic of the wedding is a little bit different. So the guest lists are usually, you're looking at over 100 people. Like 100 people is considered a small, intimate affair most of the time. And it sounds ridiculous, but when my husband and I got married, I remember we sat down and we just wrote down our immediate guests, like our immediate family members, and the list was something like 90 people. So it's one of those things where they tend to be large, they tend to be over the top. And I must encourage everyone, like if you ever had the chance, try to go for a Sri Lankan wedding because they're quite phenomenal.
Where are they usually held? I mean, it must be our houses are not big enough for several hundred
Oh
guests
no,
anymore.
no, never. Very rarely would a wedding be held at home. It's usually like a hotel or a venue like that, or like there are wedding halls. There are places that people can rent out just for the purposes of holding weddings.
Is the whole idea of the, the marriage broker, the person who brings the bride and groom together, is that largely gone away now? Most of it, the brides and grooms, they pick out each other. But I know more about Indian, weddings and Indian courtship than I do about Sri Lankan, and I don't want to equate them out of ignorance here.
They are similar. It is. It depends again on sort of your immediate sort of where you fall on the like what society essentially is. In certain cases in Colombo, they would still do things like they would check if your horoscopes would match, for instance. So when you start, hello, sorry, can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, okay, sorry, I just heard a funny sound. So yeah, in Colombo, for instance, they would most likely, depending on your religious beliefs and how traditional your family is, you would check horoscopes to see if there's a good match, between the couple. There are certainly marriage brokers that still exist. I don't think it's as strict as it used to be, certainly. And I mean, you still get to hear some of the stories coming out of India, and it gives me the impression that it's still very, like, highly prevalent there. Amongst Colombo society, it's far less prevalent. It does still happen in other parts of the country. A lot of the time, it's more like introductions. Your family will hear of someone, perhaps they might even go a step further and check and see if your horoscopes match, and they create these introductions, which you see Kavi's family do as well for her. They keep bringing along these eligible bachelors just like for tea and to introduce them. And I mean, it's something that, for example, a lot of my unmarried friends, like they have to deal with that a lot. This randomly they come back home and there'll be some guy sitting in their living room, and their parents will be like, oh look, it's just Auntie so-and-so's son who's down from England, and he'd love to just say hi. And they just look at their parents and like, I know what you're trying to do here. But that's more how it is. I think Colombo has gotten, in some senses, is a little bit more modernized now and far more open to dating and relationships kind of blossoming on their own. So yeah, it's definitely shifted over the years.
But you point out a really true thing, which was that marriage, certainly oftentimes up until fairly recently, was like it's a family merger. And so, a lot of that whole routine was based on finding people that had common interests, a shared background, their families got along, the expectations for the couple would be relatively similar. And divorce wasn't an option. And I think there were many benign intentions behind it all, but then on the other hand, it could lead to some situations where people ended up being married that would have been better had they not. But it was more of a marriage contract, and it reminds me very much of the European aristocracy, where really it was much more a financial transaction than anything else. You'd have one family with property, and then you'd have a family that, needed it, but maybe they had a title or they had something that the more prosperous family didn't have. And so it was all like horse trading, to a great degree. And then there were rituals after marriage, where if you married and you had, 2 or 3 children or something, after that, people could go their separate ways and nobody really, raise their eyebrows at it, whatever. It was just part of the deal. But I wasn't sure. I mean, I'm not saying I think that the modern marriage system with more divorces actually any more successful than the older system, where families kind of worked it out. And, maybe people weren't dizzily in love, but maybe they had longer, more successful marriages. I don't know. I mean, it
depends on what it depends on what your definition of success is, of course. I think the expectations certainly can be different going into a marriage. And it's a spectrum, and it really just comes down to what you want, what your family wants, and what your approach to the whole institution of marriage is.
Some of us have had trial marriages. I had a couple, so I've been
Oh, yeah.
long and happily married now for a very long time. But I think it's also harder to get it right when you're young.
Mhm,
You're very fortunate if you do. My parents were very fortunate. They married and met in college, married right afterward, stayed
mhm,
married forever. But you know yourself so much less well than
mhm.
it's, I think, difficult sometimes to make a really good choice. My husband often says to me, if we'd met when we were younger, we might have just killed each other. That would have been it. So there we are. Anyway, this week-long wedding is the background for this. And because Kabi's family is affluent, it's a pretty posh wedding.
Mhm.
And that really, do you think that background enhances the story? I mean, this would be a different story. Maybe if this were a bare bones wedding and they were picnicking on the beach or something.
Well, the atmosphere of the wedding, I think, certainly lends itself to some of the suspense that it tends to build through the story. No, I just think with these grand events, oftentimes all we see is the very shiny, very beautiful surface, and we don't often see what's just simmering beneath that. And I actually had the idea for setting this book at a wedding when I was at one of these over the top Sri Lankan weddings myself. I remember I was sitting there and admiring everything because, of course, they're just beautiful, beautiful affairs. And the decor was gorgeous, and the table, the centerpieces, and the couple looked like straight out of a magazine, gorgeous. And just I happened to glance over, this was completely coincidental. I happened to glance over at the groom's mother, and she was smiling and she was greeting everyone. And it was just for this second, or like half a second even, but this look just passed over her face, and it was a look of pure just frustration and rage. And she looked like she was having a moment, and it was just for a second. Of course, immediately her mask was back on, and she was back to smiling and just being this wonderful, pleasant mother of the groom. And it really got me thinking, how much is going on behind this facade, almost. And of course, then the thriller writer in me went, hey, wouldn't it be fun to throw a dead body into the mix and see where this story goes? Um, but it was definitely what gave me the idea. I thought, you know what, it's like a pressure cooker in here, right? There's so much that has to go a certain way. There's so much that has to go right. Tensions are already high. You're bringing two families together. Perhaps the two families don't match exactly in terms of values and their ideas of marriage and all of that. And you're trying to combine all of these elements in. It's almost like a tinderbox. It's just waiting for that spark to completely ignites. So I just thought, wouldn't this be a fun setting to play with? And then, of course, it was just being able to bring in these Sri Lankan elements and parts of my culture that not many people, I think, in the US or just globally have much experience with. So for me, that was a huge honor to be able to introduce parts of my culture to um, Western audiences.
Well, certainly that makes reading your book an even more wonderful experience. But you have to think that weddings of this scale, they're really theater. I mean, to a great degree, there's to make it all of the rituals and the whole bit come off. It takes a lot of behind the scenes work, a lot of planning, a lot of staging. Everybody has a role to play. And,
Mhm,
among all the other things that emotions that can overcome people is just exhaustion,
mhm.
because there's a lot of nervous pressure. So the groom's mother might have just been for a moment showing
Oh,
her,
yeah,
just like, I hope this is going to be over soon. And I hope
sure.
nothing happens that, throws it
Yeah.
off.
Yeah, I mean, maybe the caterer got something wrong. Like, it could have been just the smallest thing, but I think what was interesting for me is like we'd never know, right?
Yeah.
Like you'd never know what's going on in her mind. And for me, obviously, as a writer, that's the thing that's most interesting. And I think I've done that my whole life, where I'd look at someone and just be so fascinated by what they're feeling and why they're feeling the way they're feeling, and wanting to almost come up with a scenario as to why they're behaving the way they are or feeling the way they are. So yeah, it's just an interesting observation for me always.
Well, as a writer, I think, you're always watching, observing, listening, see how it goes. We talked about this last year when we met over My Sweet Girl, but for those who didn't do that, remind me, what is your background leading up to your becoming a published author? Because this is only your second book. What professional or personal background did you have that you brought to your writing?
Um, well, a big mix of things, I would think. So I grew up in Colombo, and then I went to college in the Bay Area in California. And after marrying my husband, I moved to the UK, and we were there for a few years, and then we moved back to Colombo, and we've been here ever since. I worked as a corporate trainer, which is a lot of fun, and I enjoy it very much. And my husband and I also have a chain of cookie stores, which is again, that's just been a really fun experience, and everyone laughs at me because they say it's the most out of character thing a thriller writer could do. But yeah, so that's sort of professionally what I do. And then in terms of writing, I think I've always been a very, very avid reader from a very young age. I was one of those very boring children where my parents would be like, go out and play, and I'd be like, no, leave me alone, I just want to read my book. And so writing always just seemed like the next logical step for me. It wasn't something that I ever chose to consciously do. It's just something that I've always done, from trying to figure out my own feelings and journaling and writing in a diary and all of that when I was younger, to those terrible, like, angsty teen poems, that I think most of us have written at some point in our lives, especially during those teenage years. But I really toyed with this idea of writing a novel for a while. And then my 30th birthday was coming along, and I was like, if I don't do this now, it will never happen. Or to be so young and naive again. But I did think very naively that if I didn't get it done by my 30th birthday, that it would never happen and I would be a failure. So I wrote a book, and I self-published it in Colombo mostly, and it got selected for this local award called the Fairway National Literary Award, which was a huge boost to my confidence, and gave me sort of that little push to pursue writing professionally and seek out a traditional publishing agreement, which was sort of the goal for me. I knew very early into self-publishing that it definitely wasn't for me. And I was very, very fortunate that after I wrote My Sweet Girl, it wasn't called My Sweet Girl then, I was very lucky to have met my wonderful agent, Melissa Danasco, who really helped me refine the story some more and then take it out. And again, absolutely lucky to be able to work with my wonderful editor, Jen Monroe at Berkeley. And yeah, the rest has been what it is.
So your husband is supportive of your writing career?
Oh, very much so. I actually feel really bad for him because he has to deal with all my writing ups and downs, because I always say being a writer is like being on an emotional roller coaster. One day you come out and you're like, yes, I'm a genius, I killed it, like I nailed this chapter, I am so fantastic. And like the next day you come out and like, I'm a total failure, this is like, why am I even doing this, it's so horrible, whatever I write is garbage. And so he's got to deal with all of that. And he's also usually my first reader, so he's very good at kind of picking out the plot holes, and like if there are certain little loops that haven't been closed properly, he's usually the first to notice them. And it's very funny because sometimes he'll give me feedback and I'll be very, very against it. I'm like, no, that's not a good idea at all. And that's not something I want to do. And that's not the direction I want to take. And I'll argue and he'll be like, yeah, okay, fine, fine. This is just my thoughts. It's your book. It's cool. But then oftentimes I find either my agent or my editor will give me the exact same advice. And he'd just be sitting there like, didn't I tell you first? But yeah, he's great. He's wonderful. He's been so, so supportive. It really helps to have that one person that reads whatever you write first and just give you that unfiltered. And he's not, just because we're married, he's not sugarcoating anything. So I have a friend who's who's like, her husband reads her whatever she writes, and he's always like, oh honey, this is so amazing, you're going to be a New York Times bestseller, I just know it, this is going to be your big hit. And I was like, yeah, that's not what I get most of the time. I get hey, this is good, but did you think about oh hey, like this doesn't make sense, like why don't you fix this? So like, no, what are these character motivations? I'm like, that's the feedback I get. So he can be very critical, but of course I appreciate it very much.
I would say you're extremely lucky, to have
I am, of
somebody,
course.
you really are, to have somebody that is that invested in your work as much as you are, really, and is not tearing you down, but rather helping you improve it, I think,
Oh yeah, definitely. One of our favorite things to do is to just sit down and brainstorm random ideas. So I kind of use him as a sounding board a lot. And then also we're oftentimes just, if we're sitting down, he'd be like, hey, have you ever thought about like this scenario? And I'll be like, oh, you know what, maybe this. And like, we'd be bouncing these ideas off each other all the time. And that's really fun. And yes, you're right. I am very, very lucky to have someone like that in my life.
So now that we've covered all that, what is it you are working on next? Because I'm going to assume this is not your second and final novel.
No, I am working on something that I'm really, really excited about. Unfortunately, it's not been announced yet, so I really can't share too many details about it, which makes me really sad because I am so excited about this story that I'm working on. I can say that it involves a lot to do with Sri Lanka. So there are definitely a lot of cultural elements, and it's still very much in sort of the suspense thriller vein. But that's about all I can say, and I should stop myself because I have terrible foot and mouth syndrome. And yeah, it's a very slippery slope for me. I'll get excited and I'll start blabbing, and then I don't want to spoil anything before the announcement actually goes out.
I asked that question just to give your readers a sense of hope that there will be a new book. I don't think it matters so much, what the new book is the fact that there is a new book.
Yeah. Really... Oh no, certainly there will be another book coming.
Right.
Fingers crossed, there will be many more. So.
Oh, I can see that it's an addiction for you, like it is for most writers once you really get into it. But I guess the other question I would ask you is, it's clear from the two books that you've written that you really enjoy what the scientific or the science fiction community calls world building. In other words, you like, taking new characters in a new world and putting them all together rather than moving the same characters along. So, do you see that is more likely to... I talked to Lisa Joel 2 or 3 weeks ago, and the book she published this summer called The Family Remains.
The Family Remains. Yes,
right.
That was a sequel, right? To
it's the only, that's my point. It's the only sequel that she's written. And she says she's never going to write another one, that it does not really interest her to revisit the characters. She likes to create them, create their world, and do whatever she's going to do to them. And then it's time, they're done, and she wants to move on to a new one. And I find it interesting talking to writers who write series about why they do that, and then writers of the Lisa, ilk who prefer. So are you in her camp more, that you find it more interesting to start over every time?
Yeah, I think it's it definitely for me has to do with the character arc. So after, with thrillers, and the way I tend to approach my thrillers is that there's usually something that the character is either hiding, or something that has happened to them, or some traumatic event, and the book or the story is a result of how they're dealing with that situation that's happened to them. So that's usually the arc. And after that arc has been reached, for me, it's very difficult to think beyond that. It's even with My Sweet Girl, it's a question that I get asked all the time is, have you ever thought about a sequel? Is there something beyond that? And to be honest, my answer's always been no. Like, that was her story. With Amaya, with You're Invited, that is her story. And beyond that, really, I wouldn't know what to write about, because she's already faced her fears and faced this
Right.
terrible situations that she's been through, and she's come out of it. So, and no one wants to, what happens afterwards, right? Like, I'd hope she'd go on to live a happy, peaceful life, or not, or, whatever it is, it's the end. And for me, that's just where the story stops. That's where my characters, that's the conclusion. And I don't really think too much beyond that. Yeah.
Well, I think it's wonderful that writers all have different processes.
I am very much in envy of those writers who are able to write series, and you can, and in a well-written series, you can definitely see sort of the mini arcs between the books, and then like the larger arc through the entire series. And I'm just in awe of writers who are able to do that, because my mind just does not work that way. I would love for it to, but yeah.
No, but that's the important part, is for you to understand how your mind works. and you to understand your own creative process. Who was it that I talked to yesterday? Day before, I don't know. I've done, you're having a busy week. I'm having a busy week too,
right?
And I kind of lose track. But we talked about how different minds work, and how it's great when a writer is comfortable, with his or her own creative process, and there's no reason to try to compare it to anybody else's, or to think that anybody else's is better or worse. I know it was a writer who is I know who it was Haley Scrivener, the Australian author, who's got a very big new novel out called Dirt Creek or Dirt Town, depending on which country you're in. And she writes in scenes, and she doesn't write linearly, and she has to sort of piece everything together. It's, more like a mosaic for her. Other people can't write unless they're writing in a linear fashion. Other people like to get it going, but they know what the end will be. They just don't know how they're going to get there. There are so many different ways that you can craft a novel. And I really love talking to writers about how they do it. And readers always want to ask about the process. But the thing is, it's not transferable. It only works for you, the way it works for you. And it isn't going to help somebody else figure out their own process or their own journey.
Of course. I think one of the things that I used to do when I was younger is I used to read a lot of these advice books, or like these books on writing by other authors. And, I think that at a very young age, that kind of laid out to me how different every writer's process could be. And I think one of the silliest things that I've tried to do was try to emulate someone else's system, because it just doesn't work. Some of the best advice that I think I've received is just not to follow, or to pick and choose the advice that you follow, like not to take all advice on board, because it might not apply to you. And that's certainly been the case for me. I meet writers, for example, who are really disciplined and very good about sitting down at their desk and writing every single day. And they'll have these word counts that they want to hit every day, or they'll have like a checklist of, this chapter by this date and this word count. And for me, I can't do any of that. It just doesn't work for me. I'm very much a mood-based writer. Once I start my first draft, I go into, I call it my writing hole. Nobody hears from me or sees me for a few weeks, sometimes a month, maybe longer, until I just bang out this very shoddy first draft. And then, I go back and I start editing, and I'm a little bit more bearable to be around when I'm editing, rather than writing that first draft. So yeah, it's just finding a process that works for you at the end of the day, I guess.
And you can't really do it until you start writing. So
no.
I think people, I think as you start writing your early work, you figure it out as you move along.
Mhm.
So anyway, let's call up Jacob because I just stole his big question because that's the question I always encourage Jacob or Patrick or whoever's doing this to ask, and I blew it for you, Jacob. I'm sorry because I asked it myself. I couldn't resist.
It's all right. Yeah, you actually answered or asked a lot of questions that were on Facebook too, so you're on a roll.
Right.
I had a question. You are also a business owner. How do you juggle, running and operating a business with also being a writer?
Well, COVID helped out a lot with that because it made the business stuff take a bit of a backseat. But really, a lot of the businesses and a lot of what I do is with my husband. So he's very good at picking up the slack so that I can write, especially when I go into, like I said, my writing holes where I'm drafting and things like that. I understand that it's very much a privileged position to be in, that I have someone that I can rely on and depend on to help me out when I go through these moments where I don't really want to talk to anyone and not take care of anything else. But yeah, things have definitely business-wise taken a little bit more of a backseat as I've gotten more serious about writing, and since I got my publishing deals and things like that.
Sure. Yeah, we had a question. This is from Jill. What type of novels or books when you were reading when you were young? And I would add to that too. What are some of your favorite authors or inspirations, particularly in the thriller field?
Sure. So growing up in Sri Lanka, access was a little bit more limited. And what was very, very popular and famous was for us to read books by this author called Enid Blyton, who is a British author. She wrote, the famous 5 books, the Secret 7 books, and I was very obsessed with them, I would say, growing up. And it really, I think, impacted me because for me, then stories were about solving something. Stories, the kind of stories that I enjoyed always revolved around some sort of plot or some sort of mystery and having that solved. So definitely that influences me even to this day. I also read a lot of R.L. Stine growing up. I loved the Goosebump series and like Fear Street when I was a little older. It was one of the highlights of my life. I met him recently at Thriller Fest in New York. And I was such a mess. I don't know why. I just went and babbled incoherently. And he was the kindest, most gracious man. He listened to me, even though I know I made 0 sense. But yeah, R.L. Stine was his books were awesome and I loved them. A bit more recently, I obviously read a lot of thrillers. It is just my go-to. It is what I find myself reaching for. Please don't judge me. I know when I tell people, I'm like, thrillers are my comfort read, and they're like, books with murder are your comfort read? I'm like, yeah, sorry about that. But yeah, definitely there are so many amazing authors that I follow avidly and really enjoy. Obviously, writers like Gillian Flynn and Jessica Knoll and Ruth Ware. I'm huge fans of their work. Then we have newer authors like Ashley Winstead. I don't know if you have come across her latest book. It's coming out next week, The Last Housewife.
She's coming here with Sandra Brown, actually. I worked it out.
Oh, you're so lucky. Oh, that's amazing. Ashley's lovely. She's lovely. You guys
lovely. She was
you guys are gonna have
our first mystery book last year. We did a wonderful Zoom event.
Right.
And she guest hosted a thing or two, but I'm really glad she's going to come to the store.
Yeah, she's amazing. Oh, you guys, I'm so jealous. You guys are going to have a wonderful time. I'm also a huge fan of, say, Jennifer Hillier. I don't know if Eliza Brazier, she's her last book, Good Rich People, was something that I absolutely loved. I can go on for a long time, but I should probably stop. I read a lot in the genre. I love thrillers, and definitely just one of those big thriller fans.
Wonderful. Well, we are too, as it all turns out. So how very fortunate. Is there anything else, Jacob?
I think that's it.
All right. Well, then let me hold it up again. You're Invited by Amanda Jayatissa. And if you somehow missed My Sweet Girl, they're completely different books, so you don't have to read them in any order. But if you missed it, it's now available in paperback and you might want to catch it. This is a new hardcover book that has just come out this week. Thank you for sharing some of your publication week with us, Amanda. It's lovely to see you again.
No, it was my pleasure, Barbara. Thank you so much for having me for the second time. This was so much fun.
Well, maybe we'll lure you to Scottsdale, or perhaps I couldn't go to Thriller Fest this year because I had a leg injury and I couldn't walk, and you can't go to New York if you can't walk, it's just not even possible. But I'm really looking forward to coming next year. So maybe we will meet there, if not
maybe
before.
Fingers crossed. Yeah.
It'll be great. All right. Good night, everybody. Or for you, good morning.
Thank you.
And Jacob, we are moving from Sri Lanka to Taiwan in 28 minutes. So
wow.
I know I'm going to leap into the car and drive down to the store and talk to an author who's writing about night markets in Taiwan, which,
that is
like
amazing.
Sri Lanka, has recently been in the news for reasons not literary, but pretty scary. The political upheaval in Sri Lanka and, what the people in Taiwan have been going through. It's really, the whole world is in a thriller mode at the moment, right? So
that's a good way of putting it. Yeah,
it really is.
Mode.
Anyway, Jacob, I'll see you in about 20 minutes. Good night. Hello. We hope you're enjoying our programs and podcasts with authors. We'd like to expand them, and your help would be appreciated. Please make a donation at poisonedpenfoundation.org. 100% of the proceeds will go to help connect authors with readers in this difficult time. Thank you.